talking to Ted Blostein. He is part of the 23rd Tank Battalion headquarters. And my name is Charlie Henson. And thanks for coming today. And like I said, we're going to start with who your family were, names, where'd you come from?
How it all started. Well,
Yes.
I couldn't tell you that, but my dad and my mother both came from Europe, Lithuania and Latvia, in that area. They apparently, as the story goes, that when a friend of my dad's went into World War I, he had asked my dad to look after my mother, because at that time the friend and my mother were a pair, and it turned out that my dad married my mother, and they still remain friends with the guy who had gone off to war. So I was born in New York City, July 11th, 1922. I suspect they wanted me for the 4th, but I was stubborn and held out for a week. And I spent my youth in New York City, in Manhattan. I went to public school there. My dad had his business in Hoboken, New Jersey, and he commuted every morning. He started a brand new business with a few friends and I really didn't know my dad until I was into my teens, because it was a situation where he would leave early in the morning, come home late at night, and maybe sometimes didn't come home at all. And so I was in bed when he left in the morning, and I was in bed when he came home at night, and if he came home. So his business was in Hoboken, New Jersey. When I finished junior high school in New York City, he decided he had enough of this commuting, so we moved to Jersey City, New Jersey, and I finished my high school there, William L. Dickinson High on the Hill in good old Jersey City. Then I went on to college at St. John's University in Brooklyn. And the reason I did that is I had a choice between St. John's and NYU. Well, believe it or not, NYU was $8 a credit and St. John's was $7 a credit, and that's what made me make the choice to pick a school to go to, because that was Depression time and those bucks added up in a hurry. So I commuted to Brooklyn, New York from Jersey City to go to school, and it was a time when I went at night and I worked during the day, and used the ferry across the Hudson River for that 12-minute ride to eat my sandwich and read a text or something, because I would have to take a trolley down to the ferry and then take a subway on the other side from Manhattan into Brooklyn to go to school.
Did you work for your dad?
No.
Okay, what was his business?
He was in a commercial laundry business. I worked for my dad in the fact that I guess from time to time on weekends I would, but that was not when I did work, it was, well, one job I do remember, I worked for a soda bottling company, loading trucks, and I didn't really need to worry about a gym after that, because picking up those cases of soda and loading them on trucks was enough, and that was the kind of thing. So anyway, I got my degree before I went into service, and I guess I was kind of a minority at that point, because not too many of the guys had been able to do that kind of thing.
What was your degree in?
I got a BS in economics, and it was a combined deal where after 3 years of at then the School of Commerce and 1 year at law school, I could then go on and 2 more years and get a law degree. So it was a 6-year instead of a 7-year kind of thing. That never materialized, but that's another story. So the war came along, and I wanted to do my bit, and I wanted to volunteer, but I did not want someone, and this was draft time, and I didn't want another person to be drafted because I had gone around the draft board, so to speak. So I knew the young gal who was the secretary to the board, and she told me when my number would be coming up. So if I volunteered at that point, the draft board would get credit for a body going. So at that point, I went to New York City, and of course we were living in Jersey City at that time. I really had in mind to enlist in the Navy and try to get into submarine duty. And that may sound as weird as crazy, but that's the way it was. Well, at that time, I was a little bit of flat and fabby and well out of condition. And as some people would say, like a nice Jewish boy, you see, you know, where you could grab your cheek and I was standing on a subway station of the IRT subway in Lower New York. And if I took the subway downtown, I would go to the Navy. And if I took the subway uptown, I would go to the Army. And as I was standing there pondering, and this is as true a story as can be told, I saw a gentleman come up from the subway level, in a Navy uniform, and then they had a 13-button flap in front. It wasn't the regular slacks that they wear today. And he was a mirror image of my physical stature. And I said, never, never will I be seen in a uniform like that. And that's what made me go uptown and go into the Army, okay? That's why I said before, you'll never hear a story like this before or after. So I enlisted in the Army, and I was sent to Yip Hank out in Long Island. That was an old World War I famous camp. And went through the process there. And got on a train and eventually left, and of course nobody told you where you were going. And I remember sitting facing forward, and we got into Indianapolis, Indiana. And when we left, I wasn't facing forward, but I hadn't changed my seat either, so they hooked the engine on the other end of the train, and we went going. And we ended up at Campbell in Kentucky. And I guess I was not part of the cadre, obviously, but was one of the first groups into the 12th Armored Division.
So you were 22?
I was born at 22, and this was 42, so I was 20 years old. Yeah. Yeah, I had passed my 20th birthday in July, and I enlisted in September of 1942. So I guess it was one of the early birds into the 12th Armored Division. And
at that point, it wasn't called the 12th.
Yes, it was 12.
Oh, okay.
It was 12, but it was under a regimental setup. So instead of headquarters 23rd Tank Battalion, as I recall, it was headquarters 43rd Regiment, and that kind of setup. And then after that, we were divided into this battalion and combat command setup. So I will tell you this, that once you've lived through a full year in a place like Camp Campbell, weather-wise, they can ship you any place in the world and you'll be ready for whatever weather is there. It was damp and cold and miserable, and they used top coal for heating, and it got to a point where we would have to find out the night before what the uniform of the next day was going to be, so we could take our clothing and lay it in between the two blankets we had, because otherwise the clothing was so damp and cold, this is in the wintertime, that you almost couldn't put it on because it was just unbearable. And it was, I think we were black-faced more than anything else because of that black soot that was laying all over the place. And it was all mud, and I remember, I think we grew a couple of inches every day because of the red mud clinging to the bottom of your shoes as you walked around. So you were a little taller in the evening than when you started out in the morning. But this was all part of your training, and I think it kind of paid off for having gone through all of this. So I had a rather rapid rise in the hierarchy. I never did get to be a PFC. as soon as basic was over, became a corporal, and I was in the reconnaissance platoon. And at that time, the reconnaissance platoon trained with the regimental reconnaissance company. So we did all our training with them, and we finished everything that had to be done before Thanksgiving of before 42. And we were ready to relax, you see. Only we found out that headquarters company had not finished their basic training. They still had to go out in the rifle range. And they wanted us to go out and pull targets for them while they did that. And we didn't think that was fair at all. So a number of us got very sick the day before Thanksgiving. And we reported to sick call. And immediately after that, got in a cab and went to Nashville, Tennessee, and got on an airplane to go home. And all we had was, we didn't have any pass at all. I mean, it was just the way it was. And there were a number of us who were doing it. We were at least a half a dozen I can think of very quickly. Some to New York, some to Chicago, all of those kind of things. Well, in those days, they didn't have computers, obviously. And in order to get flight space, you needed some sort of priority. Well, we were able to book from Nashville. Our flight was to go to Cincinnati, change in Cincinnati, and then go on to New York. Well, we get to the airport, and we find out that the connecting flight at Cincinnati had been taken over in priority, so they put us on another flight via Washington, D.C. And when I finally got to LaGuardia in New York, the first thing I did was check on my return flight. And they didn't know about me because since we didn't show up in Cincinnati for the connecting flight, they figured we weren't coming. So here we are, you know. And so we sweated all day Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. It wasn't a very pleasant day, and nothing could happen in the air flight. So I had to get on a train Saturday afternoon to go back. So all of this excitement was really for a little bit of Wednesday evening and Thursday, and we took the train and got back to camp, and I was arrested to quarters when I got back Sunday night. Well, we had a very understanding company commander, Captain Meltzer, I remember his name was, who was a pharmacist by trade, and I guess was in the reserve, and we had I guess you'd call it a summary court-martial. I don't think it ever appeared on our records, and but we were restricted to quarters through the end of the year for a month. And an interesting aside, I remember New Year's Eve we were all sitting there because we weren't allowed to go anyplace. And all of a sudden there's a banging on the door and somebody yells attention, and it was a battalion commander who had chosen to be on duty New Year's Eve so his officers could have the night off. And I forget his name, but he was really a great guy. And he wanted to know what we were doing in the barracks on New Year's Eve. And we told him what had happened. So, okay, he left, and about 15 minutes later, there's a banging on the door again, and he comes back with about 4 sacks of soda pop and all of that kind of stuff, and celebrated New Year's Eve with us. These are the kind of things you kind of remember in the situation. And then my rise went very quickly after that. After I became corporal, I think it was corporal for a couple of weeks or so, I became a buck sergeant, 3-striper, and soon after that, that was a squad leader, and then I became the platoon leader for the reconnaissance platoon as a staff sergeant. And held that until I think right after maneuvers in Tennessee. And we got down to Barclay after that, and I was promoted to tech sergeant, and I became the battalion intelligence NCO, I think was and from there on in I was in intelligence work and worked in battalion with the S2.
Could you give us since this tape is going to be used for years and years and years, give us kind of a nutshell description of what you did, maybe the reconnaissance, and then how that worked into your intelligence, and talk about that job, your job, and what you did and how you did it for us.
Well, the reconnaissance platoon was, I guess what it says it is. It was a small group who did some reconnaissance work for the headquarters, for the battalion CO, really, and the battalion group. And I have to tell you an aside, though, in Tennessee, the maneuvers, our radios weren't all that great, and since we were in the mountains and hills of Tennessee, your radius was pretty small. And I can remember on one maneuver we lost all contact with everybody, and there was no sense running around because we didn't know where the heck we were going or what we were going to do. So we held up at a farmer for 3 days. We collected our little nickels and dimes, and I think the farmer got more money in those few days than he'd ever seen in a year in his life. And they fed us for 3 days, and then after the week was over, we knew the maneuver was over, and we eventually found our unit and whatnot. So that's a little sidelight as to intelligence and how to work. So reconnaissance was, seeking out the enemy and finding out what it was all about and reporting back. I think if I can just jump ahead for a minute, I think that type of reconnaissance was more informative than the stuff we would get from upper headquarters coming down from the general staffs and so forth, because I think by the time that stuff filtered down, it was ancient history already, whereas the guys who were right in front of you went out and saw what was going on and came back. And I think part of the reason that I was promoted into the intelligence section was because of the fact that I had a college education. I have to believe that played something into it. And that was, I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed working then. We were busy mapping out maneuver situations out in Barclay out in the field there, doing that kind of a lot of map reading work and a lot of field work. In fact, I have one. I work. My battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel Meggs, who was killed the first day in the combat, and I thoroughly enjoyed working with Meggs. I think many of the officers, and it was only confirmed last night in a conversation with one of the guys up at the hospitality room, that most of the officers didn't like him because he was a West Pointer and he was a very strict disciplinarian. And you could tell Meggs walking down the road when he was, I don't know how many blocks away, his stature was such and his walk was such that it was military, A to Z, and he was as straight as a ramrod. And as I say, you didn't have to see his face because you just had to see him walking. You are. And I enjoyed working with him because you always knew where you stood with him. Good, bad, or indifferent, you knew. You didn't have to second guess. You didn't have to worry. If you screwed up, you knew you screwed up. And if you did it right, you knew you did it right. And I've always liked that kind of approach, and I try to have done that kind of thing myself. So
was he wasn't, personality-wise, what kind of personality did he have? Or did that personality didn't have much, it was just the military?
It was strictly military. And I think it reflected itself in what the officer relationship was, which, of course, I don't think he ever got too close to anybody other than, I guess, his peers somewhere along the line. But in order to have that discipline, you couldn't get, quote, too chummy with anybody underneath you because that was the nature of the beast. It may not be what he wanted particularly, but in order for him to be successful in his in his position, he had to take that stance. And coincidentally, it happened to me in civilian life, and I worked for a guy who, after hours, wouldn't know you existed because he was the boss and you were working for him, and that was the line. But he was a human being at the same time, though. One little incident, if I may, he and I went out one day to map out a maneuver, and we had selected an area for a bivouac. And when we got back to headquarters, we were laying the thing out, and one of us said, well, it's on the right side of the road, and the other one said it's on the left side of the road. And we discussed that for a while, and I guess he said, well, the only way to prove it is to see who's right is to go back out. Okay, fine. And he loved to drive a Jeep. That was one of his whatevers. So we get in a Jeep and we start heading out, and both of us at the same time, somewhere along the line, look at each other and we broke out laughing. Why? Because he was looking at it coming from one direction, I was looking at it coming from the next direction. We're talking about the same darn place, but coming in different. But he was human enough, you see, to understand that, and under other circumstances, I could see where he could have been kind of angry about it and whatnot. But in this circumstance, as I say, we both cracked out laughing, and here I am, a miserable little tech sergeant with a lieutenant colonel, and I think in those years that separation was more than it is today in the service. And so that was him. And so before we getting ready to leave Barclay to go up to Camp Shanks to go overseas, he called me in, and he wanted to know why I had never gone to OCS, having had a college degree and all that stuff. And I told him, I said, I hadn't planned on making the Army my career, and you soldiered with these guys, you started out with them, and you hope you'd stay with them through the end, and the camaraderie that had. And so he said, well, how would you like to be a warrant officer? I said, well, after a couple of years in the service, you do learn something, and yes, that would be. He said, well, when we go overseas, we'll be allowed a certain percentage of strength over the table of organization. And they had changed the regulation where the person in charge of the personnel section, which had been a master sergeant, was now going to be a warrant officer. And he felt that I would be capable to handle a personnel situation. So, fine. And I got promoted to master sergeant, but I was special duty with the G1 section because the G1 had a warrant as his assistant, and that was being changed to master sergeant. So it was this swap, you see. And in order to find a place on a table of organization for a master sergeant that was open, I got, paper-wise, got that position. Well, when it came to go overseas, I found out that I had to travel with the G1 section, because when you got aboard ship and they read your TO out, you got to say here when they asked for the master sergeant for the G1. So I separated from the headquarters of 23rd at that point and went up to division headquarters. And that was a very unpleasant situation. The G1 had his warrant officer sent overseas in the advanced detachment. So he kind of got him out of the way. And then, of course, when we got onto these high seas and the floating dock at Cherbourg broke loose and they couldn't accommodate the division in France, and we got transferred, we got separated and deposited all over England and Scotland and wherever. And so we finally got the division back together again. Colonel Mayer was a real miserable guy. And so, and I think there was a little bit of anti-Semitism involved at that point also. I've only had it once before when I got the tech sergeant's job back in Barclay. The assault gun platoon sergeant thought that he should have had a crack at it too, and that showed up, but we clarified that pretty well and that worked out. But this was, he was one miserable guy. And so I did what I had to do, and I tried to get a hold of Meg's, and of course it was difficult to make contact then. And I stayed with him, and then they brought the advanced detachment back, so his warrant officer came back, and here I am trying to learn the business a little bit and reading Army regulations that come down, and I had them literally pulled out of my hand. I mean, you weren't supposed to know that, see? Well, here I am, a master sergeant up in division headquarters, and they had me sweeping floors. Not only in the G1 section, but in the G3, whose office was next door. And I knew that they were trying to get me to renege so that they can bust me down to a buck private or something and get rid of me, and I just made up my mind that I wasn't going to give in that way. Well, finally, they had to set up an awards and decorations section. So apparently the general had a lieutenant who had lost favor, so they picked him to head up the awards and decorations section, and they transferred me in with him to help set up the awards and decorations section. And I'm at this point now in rear echelon, and we're setting up the section, and I befriended a first lieutenant who was with the Inspector General's office. And we got to talking, and apparently everybody was trying to figure out how the G1 was able to hold on to his warrant when all the other G officers had given up their warrants and gotten master sergeants, you see, in their stead. Oh, this chap asked me about it, and we discussed it, and I told him what had happened from the time Meggs had called me into the office in Berkeley. Well, he went back and told the IG about it, and next thing I know, I'm asked to come in and talk to the IG. And Colonel Hill, I think his name was. Nice old gentleman, real country kind of guy and easy to talk to. He was a lieutenant colonel. And I told him my story, and he said, would I be willing to sign a statement to that effect? Well, these are the facts. I think it was 10 or 12 pages of type. And I signed that, and the next thing I know, I'm ordered to report to the Chief of Staff, who I think was Colonel Gordon at that time. There was a swap around that time, and I think it was Colonel Gordon, but it was full colonel. And at that point, it was a little bit uneasy when I had to report to him. So he made me much at ease, told me to sit down. Said, Sergeant, relax. He says, I want you to know one thing. Whatever's coming to you, you're going to get. But by the same token, whatever's coming to the Army's going to get. So, again, we knew where we were. It was an even playing field. And he asked me if this was my statement. He had the copy. Excuse me. And I said, yes, it was. And we went through that. And he says, well, at least one mystery is solved here. And I said, what's that? He says, at least we find out how the G1s maintain his warrant. Okay. So we have a pleasant conversation, after which he says, well, we'll have to get a board of inquiry to find a position and grade for you. And I looked at myself and I said, boy, this is democracy in action. Here we are in the middle of a war, guys are getting killed all over the lot, and they're worried about finding a place for me. Well, believe it or not, they set up a inquiry board with a lieutenant colonel and a couple of majors and a couple of captains. And I vaguely remember one or two of them. And at that point, I could have had a defense counsel if I wanted one, and I could have asked for any witnesses, no matter where they were in uniform in the world, would have had to be brought in for this board of inquiry. So my little friend from the IG office says to me, Ted, play it cool. Just go in there. You know you have a good record. Some of the fellows you served with who are on the board. Don't call anybody. Don't call any witnesses. Just go in there, answer their questions, tell them the way it is, and I'm sure it'll work out all right. Well, a number of meetings were called for and then had to be canceled because there was a war going on. But eventually they held one, and it was recommended that I get one stripe taken away, go back to tech sergeant, which I was when this all started, and I was sent back to headquarters company 23rd as a sergeant in excess. And so I'm back to where I started from. Haven't lost anything very much. Had a little bit of an experience of being up in division headquarters, and I guess made a few bucks out of it while I was a master sergeant as against being a tech sergeant, which was only a couple of cents at that point. And then that was it. I honestly can't remember too much of what the heck I was busy with at that point until Easter Sunday of 1945, when we got hit very badly, and percentage-wise, many of our officers were either killed or wounded. And I was requested, in quotation marks, to serve as the battalion what's the word I'm looking for? We had to pick up the dead and process them. Graves registration officer. I filled in the spot of the graves registration officer. And that was, of course, not very kind duty. As many of these guys you knew, and some of the stories, at that point, it made me a fatalist. Why one guy moved from one spot to another for no good reason at all, but got up and moved, and one of them got killed and the other one didn't. And there was no reason for it. Well, I had to take care of a few friends of mine who were killed. One of the gory details we couldn't handle was a tank that was hit, and all the bodies were burnt in there, and we just couldn't. We weren't equipped to handle that. And then there was, I think, the most vivid one I have is when there were two bodies in two sacks, literally, from a tank, and Graves registration would not take them because they couldn't be they weren't positively identified at that point. So I had to go to a hospital where the other three members of the tank crew were and got documents from each one of them as to where each one was in position in the tank. And that way we could definitely define who was in sack A and who was in sack B. And it was only after that the graves registration would process the bodies to go back. So it was interesting to note that from that point of view, graves registration was doing everything it possibly could to make sure of the remains that they were accepting were properly identified. And I think
Tell us, where were you on Easter Sunday? Where was this located?
Somewhere in Germany. I really didn't commit that to memory. I was too busy just moving around. And that was pretty much it. And so we wrote. That was near the end of the Easter Sunday. 45 was pretty much near the end of the hostilities and whatnot. And we ended up in war in Augsburg, Germany. And an interesting sight along the way, we had Sergeant Wisniewski, who was the communication sergeant for the battalion. And he wouldn't throw anything away and picked up everything he could. And somewhere along the line, we overran a German paymaster wagon. And old Stanley Wisniewski picked up a couple of bales of German money and stashed it in a half-track. And when we got, after the war was over, we set up a zebra house. You had to be at least a tech sergeant to come into there, when there were about 3 or 4 of us in there. And he had all this Wehrmacht money that the Germans didn't want our script; they wanted our money. So we looked pretty good with with this found money that was going on. And so those are the kind of thing I mean, from an actual combat situation, you're not getting much of a story from me. Because, when I was fortunate enough not to be in a position where I had to carry a rifle and aim it at somebody or have somebody aim it at me. But It was an experience that, as my uncle said about World War One, it was worth $2 million, but he wouldn't pay a penny to go through it. And it was great just working with a bunch of guys. You learned how to live with people from all over the country in various forms of economic stratuses, education. I may be running back and forth here a little bit, but I remember now going back to basic training where we had a fellow by the name of Sutton who was a honest, true Kentucky hillbilly. And when he found I was Jewish, he would not believe it because I was not the caricature with the big black hat and the big hook nose and the long frock and all of that. And it was nothing, he was a normal, everyday kind of thing. He didn't mean anything negative about it at all. He just couldn't believe that I was Jewish because it was nothing that he...
Tell me, you spoke some about...
Can we break for just a second? I take a little white pill that gets me to the camera.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there something you remembered that you wanted to tell me?
Yeah, I want to tell you what happened after the war was over. Somewhere before the ending of the war, a communication came through about what was to be called a Shrivenham American University. This was a facility in England that had been an officers' training school and had been taken over by the U.S. military, and they were going to set up a college campus. They conscripted people in uniform who had college teaching experience, and they also flew over faculty from the States to set up this university. There was no credit for this at all, but it was an educational point of view. And I had made application for this and couldn't tell you when it happened and completely forgot about it soon after I filled it out because, well, the war was over and I got transferred over to the 1st Armored Division for Army of Occupation duty. Very, very soon after the war was over. It was only a matter of days, it seemed to me. And I get sent out to a suburb of Paris where they had set up a school for Army of Occupation duty. And that was great place. It was an estate of somebody like Carnegie or Mellon or somebody that had this place outside of Paris. And the first time we'd had fresh fruit and fresh milk and all of those nice things. So it was a combination of good living after all the months of not so good living. And I went through that, and on my way back, heading back to my unit, the commanding officer of the 23rd was heading back to Paris. He was going back to the States to Leavenworth to go to Command and General Staff School.
And what was his name?
Don't ask me.
Okay.
Don't ask me. And he wanted to know if I wanted to go back to Paris with them, and then I would help his driver come back. And I said, fine. I had a couple of francs left in my pocket, and so we did that. And you're going to laugh, but one of the things I remembered about Paris was the American Red Cross building was in a triangular building. It was like an iron with a point coming out, and alongside along the long side of the building were 3 grades of prostitutes. Okay, one who would only have anything to do with officers, and one that would only have anything to do with non-commissioned officers, and another group had nothing to do with enlisted men. And we stood across the street watching this operation. I'm telling you, it was a riot. And how they would bargain with each other to make a contract. It was one of the asides anyway. So I went back and saw the colonel off, got back to headquarters, and I found a note on my bunk that said, no matter when you come in, wake up the first sergeant. And I did that, and my orders were to leave at 6 a.m. the following morning to go to the Shrivenham American University.
Spell this for us.
Shrivenham, Shrivenham. And so I almost didn't have to unpack and repack, and took off to England and spent what they call two semesters there. I remember we ended the second semester right around Christmas time. At that point, at this campus, it was almost not military. Everybody was pretty much on an even keel. You didn't have to recognize officers and salute them on campus and things of that nature. As I say, I had finished my college education before I went into service. I never had the opportunity to study anything in political science, and this gave me an opportunity to find out a little bit about that. So you set up your own programs. I mean, there was nothing really overly structured in this. So I remembered I went to school I had 3 courses, roughly from 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12, and I was finished at noon every day, which worked out great from Friday noon to Monday morning, and there was no reveille or anything like that. You just got up and went to class. So you didn't even have to be in at any particular hour as long as you were there to go to class at 9 o'clock, I guess. So I got to be able to travel around England a bit because the Office of Transportation would give you a pass, and you were able to roam around. And I'll tell you another little anecdote which really shouldn't be made note of, but when the guy behind the desk bent down to pick something up, a pair of passes seemed to disappear, and we were able to travel first class for a couple of long weekends, shall we say, after that. But they told me if it wasn't nailed down, it was movable, right? So we got to see a good bit of England that way, and I remember New Year's Eve we were up in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I have to admit, Scotch are really very, 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 very nice people to be with. There were 3 or 4 of us together, and we kind of met a couple of young ladies, and the ceremony there was the culture there was at midnight everybody met at the town church, and the bells would peal, and then you went visiting family all night long. You went from one house to another, and we were invited to go along. And one of the things I recall is that in one of the houses there was this little old gentleman sitting there, shining his shoes and also shining the soles of his shoes, because we were told that preserved the leather, you see, and with the waxing it made them. A crazy thing that sticks in your mind, amongst a lot of things that have nothing to do with this. And at that time, there was one point, it's the only time in my life when there's a void, because I know I woke up in my bunk in the Red Cross, but how I got there, I will never be able to tell you. But that was an experience also in life, and then soon after that we got orders to come back, and we were coming home on the USS Lake Champlain, which was a aircraft carrier built by the bonds that were bought by the people of the state of New York, and they had stripped that. And the ship held a ribbon for the fastest crossing from Norfolk, Virginia to Italy and back in both directions. So this was right after New Year, right after Christmas, and we figured we could be home for New Year's Eve. You say, I mean, what the heck? They did it in, 4 days or something? Well, we get aboard, and we find out after we get going that there's a storm in the North Atlantic, a storm in the South Atlantic, and this captain is trying to work between the two. However, if he gets back to New York before a certain date, he would have to return, and it was called the green carpet, I believe, go back and get another group of GIs and bring them home. But if he got to New York after that date, he goes to the Caribbean, and when we arrived in New York, it took us 14 days in convoy to go over in September of 43, I guess it was, 44. And it took us 14 days to come home singly because of the weather and because he didn't want to get back before that date. Well, we were in a unit that didn't pull any duty on that ship all the way back. I was flabbergasted. We were billeted in the very stern of the ship, the back of the ship, and we would go out and stand on, I guess, what you'd call a fantail, and that thing would raise out. It seemed to me we were as far out of the water as the Empire State Building was high. It looked like forever from where we were down to the, and that ship would come down and hit that water, and you wondered why it didn't split apart. But it was constant beating. I never have been on a ship like that before. It was an experience that, we had never witnessed and had no idea about. Well, at any rate, we get to see the Statue of Liberty as we're coming into the harbor. And then there's a command over the radio, now hear this, whatever the unit was that we were with, was then directed to clean up the ship after everybody had left. So I landed back home with a garbage can in my hand as I got off the gangplank. That was only one of many trips. And then after that, we made our way to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, at which point we were separated out as to where our homes were. And I ended up at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, because my folks lived in New Jersey at that point. And they came down to pick up their darling son and lived happily ever after.
I wanted to ask you, how would the 23rd been different, or what did Lieutenant Colonel Meigs bring to the 23rd? Besides the military bearing stuff, what would it have been different if there had been somebody else there?
I think so. Of course, we can only surmise at this point. But because of the training we got under him, I feel we were as close to being professional soldiers as is possible for civilians to accomplish. I think we made for better soldiers because of what we were made to do. Because for what we had to do right, or keep doing over until we got it right. And it was these little things in the long run that I feel made the difference between knowing what you had to do, as maybe not knowing as well what you had to do. Now, whether that makes sense, I don't know, but that to me is the fine point. He was a tough taskmaster, but for a purpose. It wasn't just because he wanted to be tough and he had silver leaves on his shoulders and you didn't, and he was taking it. He was doing it for our good. And indirectly, I guess, if we were good, he was going to be better. Right? So it was a circle there. But I really feel because of the way he handled things, it made for, probably saved the lives of many guys kind of indirectly because they knew what to do and how to do it and when to do it.
Were you there when he was killed?
No, that was with this, I guess I was with the Awards and Decorations section at that time. Yeah. I mean, when he died, I lost my godfather. I mean, at that point, that took care of any of this transfer back to the personnel section and the warranty and obviously and all of that. And that's why I have a great kinship with Betsy, who was his wife, who's Monty Meigs' mother, and I have a very fine relationship with General Meigs. I consider him one of his many Jewish fathers. And I remember when he got his brigadier, when he got his first star, I wrote to him and I told him I expected that he would be chief of staff one day. and here now he's going to get his 4th star and become vice chief of staff in a month or so. So I have a special feeling for Monty, and because of his father. And we've had an interesting dialogue and an interesting relationship. It started in 1990 when he came to his first 12th association reunion. He was a full colonel then. And to think that a year ago he got his 3rd star, and here 12 months later roughly he's getting his 4th. So he had some pretty good genes to start with, and he's been at the right place at the right time, knowing the right people, doing the right things, and obviously I'm very happy for him and look forward to being present when he gets his 4th star, because I'm going to try and get a group of the 23rd to be in Washington at that time. He acquiesced to that when I spoke, when I asked him if that would be all right if we could do that. So we're looking forward to that. He's one of our boys.
Before we close, I want to ask you, is there one thing that happened in World War II, like if you were just to think of your whole experience, that is the thing that pops into your mind each time that you could share with us?
I think it would have to be a generalization as to what a great waste, what a great waste that entire situation was. The tremendous loss of life, which in my mind was so unnecessary. The sickness of one individual to be able to stir all this up and cause all of this. And the massiveness of that is just overwhelming to me. I guess many of us share the same thing, and I think we've become the world's largest group of pacifists because of that experience. And more so in something that I didn't I didn't take part in. But when they had the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and public television had as much coverage as it did, I sat there and I cried. Still do. When you think of these young kids coming out of it. Sorry. But that makes the point. That makes the point. And for whatever, however, whenever, as far as I'm concerned, there's never going to be another one.
How did World War II change you?
Well, I think I alluded to it a little bit before. It made me cognizant of other people who perchance had different values and different thoughts and came from different places and had different outlooks. And it made me realize that we all had to meld together and work together, and regardless of all of these differences, we all had to do it all together, and otherwise we wouldn't be successful. And in the long run, I think it kind of shaped me in the way of how I think about things, and any one individual can do it all by themselves. I guess Mrs. Clinton said it best when it says she said it takes a village, and it takes a village in many, many, many different ways. And I think I referred to that in my last column in the Hellcat News when I talked about ACU and saying it would take a village to make that project successful, and I would hope that we had many villagers in our midst. and so on. So to that aspect, I think it affected my life personally as to how I look at things and how I've done things. When I became president of this association, I made the point that I was going to be represent all of the people that belong to it, not any particular group. And I've been happy to be told to listen to people who tell me that I was reasonably successful in doing that, and I feel good about that.
What is the 12th Armored Division, the organization meant to you through the years?
Well, I think it kind of brings out the camaraderie that was developed in the reasonably short period of time of how we were together in uniform, and the fact that that period in our life was so important to us that we made sure that we kind of kept the contact through these years and kept the relationships going and that kind of thing, if that makes sense to you.
Okay, we have talked about a lot of things today, but in some of this I think you probably have touched on in different areas that we talked about. If you were to leave something, if this world lasts for another 25, 30, 50, 100 years, what would you want someone to look at your tape and remember? What's the lesson that you would like to convey to them in 20, 30, 50, 100 years?
Well, I guess we're talking philosophically now, are we not? Well, I think that one of the things is that people would have to understand that the life is give and take, and that you have to sit and listen and not just react, and the life is compromises. It's not a one-way street at all. Other people have views and they're entitled to their views and should be able to express them as long as they don't infringe negatively on other people, on the environment or whatever. That no one can do anything completely on their own. That other people affect what they do as they affect what other people do. And it's that kind of a philosophy that you just can't go off on your own and think you're going to conquer the world, because you ain't going to do it. And you're going to be a very sorry individual for starting off that way.
Is there any area that I have not covered? You've done a really good job covering a lot of areas. Is there something you can think about, and I'll be quiet about, something that I haven't covered or something you'd like to share with us before we close?
I think we're rather in depth in what we've discussed. I don't think it leaves very much. I think the future is going to be a little bit different than what our generation has experienced, and perchance for the better. I'll be very candid with you. I don't know how important much of the things that we have spoken about or gone through or done are going to be meaningful to our grandchildren and down the road. It's going to be ancient history in a way, because so much has happened since the end of World War II, whether you're talking medically or environmentally, or no matter what subject you can pick up. The world has moved so fast and so rapidly. I'm amazed at what you guys have put on internet. I mean, I'm a Uh, I don't have any of this equipment in my house. My daughter has one. I asked her to spit something out, and out come these pages and pages and pages out of your of what you put in. And I sat and looked at this in complete amazement. And this is what I'm talking about. These things are so different. The pace is so much faster. I mean, when I had to look something up, I had to go to a library and seek out an encyclopedia and whatnot. Today, our grandchildren sit there and press a button, and the whole world's in front of them. I don't know if I've answered your question, but we're going to be so far back in history that unless those special people are particularly interested in something like that, but as a general rule, I think unfortunately a lot of it's going to kind of be lost in the shuffle.
Before you close, I want to know about who you married in your family,
Mm-hmm.
and so we'll kind of have that and what you did.
Okay.
Your career, what you did.
Well, I met my wife to be, well, let me rephrase that. We were in adjacent baby carriages together in New York City. We lived in Manhattan. There was a little park area, and our mothers would, those are the days when you had these big carriages and whatnot, and you had to get your child some fresh air, so you marked them down to a park, and they met in the park. The mothers met in the park, and so the families kind of knew each other from way back when, and they moved from New York into Brooklyn, and we eventually moved to New Jersey, but I think we would visit each other once a year or something like that. And down the road, before I went into service, there was no particular relationship, but it developed during or after. Anyway, we got married. I got out of service in January of '46, and we were married in May. So from there on, and we have had 3 great kids: boy, girl, boy.
Names?
The oldest boy is Mark. He's married and has a family. Lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His oldest son now is, I think, 22 or 23. I shudder when I think of it. And his daughter's about 16. And our middle child is a girl who lives in Ginny, Gini, who lives in Richmond, Virginia. She has 2 children, a boy and a girl. She lost her first child when he was about 8 or 9 months old, and but went on to have 2 good kids. And the third one is Jay, and he's married and has a young daughter, now 11 years old, and they live up in Lakewood, New Jersey. And I spent my working time in the textile game. I worked for people like the Manhattan Shirt Company when it was one of the more important factors in the industry. And I worked for people like BVD, and I worked for Dan River Mills. That was and I've always been involved in something or other. And particularly when we moved to New Jersey, we lived in Metuchen, New Jersey for some 31 years, and I've always felt that everybody talks about letting George do it. Well, somebody's got to be George. And I've always been involved in my community. I volunteered my time. I was on the zoning board of adjustment for 15 years, and then served on the parking authority for 5 years in various capacities. And those I worked my way through the chairs at the local temple and spent 2 years as a president in there. So I've always been involved in something or other. So I guess this business here with the association is a continuation of that kind of thing. Excuse me. Estelle, my wife, worked for Rutgers University in administrative work. The last number of years she was with the Affirmative Action Department. That drew a lot of conversation in our house. And then she retired, and I retired soon after that, and we moved down to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where we are now, and enjoying that environment very much. Because you have UNC in town, you have Duke University 10 minutes away, you have NC State 20 minutes away, and I've been involved there, been on the Board of Adjustment in town. I'm currently president of the Homeowners Association where we live. So it's always been a busy time away from the house.
Do you mind if I ask you, you're Jewish?
Yes.
And I'm interested, are you rabbinical Jews, kosher Jews?
No.
Okay.
No, we're not. It's interesting that you ask that. We do not keep a kosher home as such. Yet my wife will not eat pork products or shrimp and those kind of. I don't subscribe to. I don't eat pork products, but I'll eat most everything else. This was her background. She came from a home that was that way. My home was not quite as indoctrinated in that sense. Interesting to note that my father's father, though, was a scribe. He wrote the Torahs, and he wrote the tefillin, if you know what those are, the little the manuscripts in there and whatnot. So it's the evolution of whatever. You know? However, from a not particularly religious point of view, but as you see, I was active in the temple because I felt that there's a need for that, for those people who really need that. We need it to a point, but there are people who really, live it and whatnot. And we felt it was important that we support something like that for the general community, not particularly for ourselves. And
well, that was just for my own interest.
Right.
That was my own interest. I just kind of wanted I just have a great respect for the Jewish nation.
Well,
Okay.
okay.
I think that's about all, unless
Okay.
there's something
No,
else
there's
that
nothing. I think
missed.
we've shut my mouth off here for a
Oh,
little over an hour.
Great.
Uh,
That's great. Well, we appreciate it, and we